And we're excited to be joined by Adam DeVander for our discussion today. Adam is a developer and marketer who has worked with API companies like Zapier, SendGrid, and held writing and editorial positions at Programmable Web, Wired, and he has a ton of experience with APIs. Would it be fair to call you Mr. API, Adam?
Wouldn't be the first time. Sure.
Not super original is what you're saying.
Yeah,
anything about your background that I missed that you want to share?
No, just working with dev tool companies at every developer now to help them better communicate all the topics around, especially around APIs. Yeah.
Indeed. And communication is tough for everybody. So that's fantastic. So we'll just dive in. At Haas, we've talked a lot about how the average team uses over 18 APIs to power their applications. Adam, I'd love if you can walk us through an example that you've shared previously about the complex web of APIs required to build even a very simple bike sharing app.
Yeah. And, even I hear that number, that 18 APIs, and that just seems like that can't be. That has to be too big, right? But then
right?
You start to think through some of the different things. So the bike sharing example, you have geolocation stuff happening there. You have to be able to communicate with the end user, probably in a mobile app some way. So you have, you might get to 18 APIs just with the cloud infrastructure to connect all
Very
that.
Very true.
Look at your AWS dashboard and you see all the different tools that you need to use. But even around the mapping, you have the actual map that you're displaying, but there's also some way to be able to keep track of all your fleet of bikes. And likely you're going to be talking to that through an API, and then knowing where each one is and what is that location. Like, I don't know, does a latitude and longitude point, does that compute in your brain? Probably not. So you need some tool to be able to say, here's the address or the intersection where that is. And then, in that example that you're referencing, it then goes into how do you communicate with those people? Do you, with your customers, do you send them SMSs and emails? Probably both. So you're going to need tools for that. You mentioned my background at SendGrid, that, that was one of the things that we often said is basically like every application needs email. Like it's got to be in there somewhere.
Right.
And so if someone says no, you say, okay, what happens if someone loses their password?
Exactly.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Yep.
And then if you're running a bike share app, you likely are charging people money to rent those bikes. So you have to have some way, you have to at least have a Stripe to be able to call into, and maybe you are taking multiple forms of payment because someone says, oh, I don't want to give you my credit card. I want to use, I want to be able to use Apple Pay.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly. Wasn't counting there, but we might've got to 18.
Right. So, as this complexity builds, what are some of those things that can go wrong with this bike sharing app, and who does it affect?
Yeah. So, each of those different services that I mentioned there could have issues. Even when you're using, we mentioned some big names there that you probably can rely on, like Google for the maps and Stripe, right? But even those have downtime. Don't let Google know that we noticed. But
it's downtime. It's degraded performance. It's all of that.
Yeah, and you asked where it shows up. It eventually shows up unless you've somehow coded around it completely. It shows up in the user experience. And in my experience, a lot of times you don't even know that. That's the problem. That so many of these apps are relying on so many APIs, and the people who built them don't actually know if they had a problem.
Yeah. No, we hear that all the time from our customers too. They, we ask them, how do you know, prior to becoming a customer, how do you know when you're having issues with these integrations? And the number one answer is their customers tell them. And they know that's not an acceptable answer, but that's the state of things today because of this of the complexity. It's because of those 18 APIs and oftentimes many more than that. That just it's tough to manage. So taking a step back for a second, jump over to you, Trung. So what are some common API issues? From your experience, are there problems that are a lot more common than others that you generally see as a developer?
Yeah, for sure. So generally, I usually categorize API issues into two buckets. Issues that are caused by the API producer and issues that are caused by API consumer. And if the first bucket, the common issues in that bucket will be server downtime, network issues, bug caused by bad code or bad data. To rub salt into the wound, the way these errors or issues manifest themselves to the consumer or to the end user very different, vary by provider. So if you think that you can have one way to handle errors, one standard way, you're gonna in for some bad time because the moment you integrate with another API, it breaks in a completely different way, and you have no idea until your customer tell you about it. Then there's the second bucket, which is most often overlooked by API consumer, are those issues caused by them. So they have requests, bad requests, they have requests being rate limited because they have went over their usage, but then there can also be network issues. So what if my requests leave my server but never make it into the other the API providers? You just get an error. The API producer doesn't have any issues because they actually never receive your request, but your customer see an errors. How do you know about that? Most of the time you don't. So yeah, so those are, I would say those are the most common issues that API consumer face.
Yeah, no, it's a great point about, you're adding new APIs that introduces new gaps in your visibility, right? And then if you don't have the foresight, that gap is going to exist until a customer runs into an issue and you experience churn and your net promoter, scores go down and word of mouth is impacted. It's a great point. Awesome. Well, continuing on problem areas, Cameron, I'd love it. I don't know if you have an example of an especially headache-inducing API issue that you've dealt with. I mean, you've built by now thousands of integrations.
Yeah, no, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned visibility because I feel like a lot of the biggest headaches that I've dealt with have been rooted in visibility, and that could be while I'm in development or that could be after I've gone to production. So, for example, when I'm in development, I'm writing an integration with a new platform that maybe I haven't integrated with before, shipping that to development environments that are making API calls. Not having visibility into those API calls and the responses that you're getting when you're developing can be really frustrating because you don't know, did the call work? Did you get an error back? And so then you find yourself building sort of ad hoc visibility solutions, writing debug logs, reading through those logs to see the request that you made, the response that you got back, did it work? A lot of times you didn't have a success, and so you need to kind of copy and paste those things into an email, send those off to a developer support advocate on the other side. So visibility has been a really big problem for me while in development mode. But it also continues when you're into production, because when you've deployed that integration, now it's in operations, you're a lot of times driving a user-facing feature with that integration. And by default, you get nothing in terms of reliability and visibility into it, whether or not that integration is continuing to work. So I've had integrations in the past where it stops working, maybe with an intermittent failure. It works sometimes, but not all the times. That results in an error that surfaces all the way up to a user who might be using it on an app. And if you don't have visibility, just basic visibility, they're the ones that are telling you that something is broken. And that's been really frustrating for me because you write these integrations, you expect the API provider to be good. When it works in development, it'll continue to work in production. That's just not the way that it works. So visibility has been kind of the biggest headache for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so, when you add a new integration, I mean, how do you think about that ongoing maintenance and an ongoing cost? I mean, you're managing teams, you've been a CTO at a number of organizations. Like, how do you think about it? And then I guess maybe if you have insight on your peers too, if you think about it differently than most.
Yeah, I think the APIs really have this really interesting hidden cost, and a lot of times that comes in. We kind of talked about user experience, but engineering cost. There's a huge hidden cost there because once you find out about something, whether it's from a user or you've seen an error in your logs, you start to realize that you need to build additional things, whether it's additional monitoring and reporting or additional reliability features, things like automatic retries, or even failover from one API provider to another. These are things that become real costs to an engineering team. They result in tickets that go on your backlog, things that you know that you need to do and eventually want to do, but you're always having to wrestle with that decision of, do we do this now, or can we put it off for a little bit longer? And always having to wonder, like, am I going to pay the price with another incident, another outage, because I decided to defer this? Because I, have to decide, do I want to build a new feature? Do I want to build reliability? That's always a really tough decision for engineering teams to have to make.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
So it reminded me of the time at Zapier, where, I mean, Zapier connects to, I think I saw now 2,000 different apps, right? And like the entire idea of the platform is to keep adding APIs. So I think for a lot of people, Cameron, to your point, the question is, do you integrate another API? Like, does the benefit outweigh that cost that you are talking about, the ongoing cost of being able to maintain that integration? At Zapier, we didn't have a choice whether to integrate more. Yeah. It's like, it's a platform, and SaaS companies are bringing their APIs to it. So the engineering team there had to be able to tune things and had to be able to look in, and not just the engineering team, actually, it was support, because you get non-technical users saying, and this can happen with a normal app too, right? A non-technical user emails in and says it doesn't work. And that's not a lot for a technical person to go on, and even less if you don't have access to any sort of logging data, any kind of information about the calls that user has. And so at Zapier, we had all of that. Every call, we could know how long it took. We could look in and see what the data, with some things removed, things like API keys you couldn't get to, right? But but being able to have that insight, because it was really important, because Zapier is integrated with 2,000 APIs. But that's the kind of insight that I think that any developer would want to have if they could. But I'll tell you, at least on the Zapier side, having talked to the engineers who built that over multiple years, that it's a lot of work to be able to create a system that gives you that kind of insight.
Absolutely. And you touched on an interesting point there, Adam, right? At the end of the day, the end user doesn't care if they purchased a service that, in part because it integrates with QuickBooks. If there's an issue where that sync isn't working, in their mind, they're not thinking, oh, it's okay, I'm going to let so-and-so off the hook. There must be an issue with the QuickBooks API. They're like, no, that was part of your core value prop to me. You're down, you're having an issue, I want my money back. And so it's just so core to, as these organizations rely on APIs, and that's how they sell themselves, it becomes this compounding problem. So jumping around a little bit, talking about monitoring, Zapier is tracking 2,000 APIs. We did a study at Haas. We surveyed developers in a bunch of different communities. And one of the insights that we learned was 50% of teams do not monitor the third-party APIs that they consume. And I guess my question to the group is, why not? Why don't they?
As a developer, I can give my personal experience. If you look at it positively, I think developer, especially those that have lesser experience, they assume that once I write my code, everything will work. There will be no issues with the API I'm calling. And then there's a mental gap between calling something that I write directly versus something that someone else owns. Right? I don't have the same responsibility. I just don't have that mindset. Like, oh, this is something that I didn't write, but it can impact my customer. So I have to be prepared for that. That mindset take a while for a developer to obtain after many battle scars. dealing with headache-inducing APIs. So yeah, so that's my experience. And anything to add, Cameron?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. It starts with not having enough experience and know that this is something that will happen and something you have to deal with. But then I think on the other end of the spectrum, I think that, when you do appreciate that this is a problem, that you actually do need to do something about it, this becomes a very big and large problem that you have to solve. There's a lot of tooling and infrastructure that you have to start to build and maintain. This becomes tickets on your backlog and things you need to start doing, cost for infrastructure to support it. And so I think that that's the other part of the reason why people don't do it, is because it's a lot of work. So they start to try to dip their toe into the water and start to solve it sort of one piece at a time. It just takes a long time to get there.
And there are a lot of different meanings of what monitoring could be, and how deep they choose to go in that. I mean, at the very simple level, you say, oh, I call these 18 APIs, let me ping each of these, once a minute, and there we go. That's all I need to do. Well, you might get a response from each of those 18 pings every minute, but that doesn't mean it's the right response. So it's like, does the right data come through? Does it come fast enough? And am I able to make a follow-up call that needs to use something from the first one? And I mean, there are monitoring tools that allow you to do this, but that is a lot of effort to be able to put together these tests. And let's just say you go to the effort to do that. So you have these 18 APIs, you have like all of the calls that you make and everything strung together. Now you change your app. You change the way you call one of them, you add a new API. Do you go back and recreate this this special web of monitoring calls to match the reality of your app? Yeah, in a perfect world you do, but the reality of developer work is that is going to get left behind. That will, if it ever looks like the reality, it only looks like it for that day, and then you've moved on to other things. And that's why, if you look at those monitoring tools, a lot of them are focused on the provider side, because that's the more likely market. More likely someone wants to say, I am providing an API. There's maybe an SLA I've provided alongside this. So I want to know when my API goes down. That's great, except that they have one API and developers are out there using 18. So it doesn't really solve the problems of the consuming developer.
Right.
Yeah, I think
even if you
really important there, which is a lot of the errors that you encounter are very subjective to the request you made, the credential you use, the status of your account on the other side, the network that you were on. Those monitoring tools can't necessarily solve for that, but they can solve for tell the provider if they're up or down, because those are less context sensitive.
Absolutely. So final question goes to you, Adam, because you are the guest of honor. So you've said that companies need to do more than just monitor their APIs, that they need, I think how you put it, extreme awareness of their API network. So what does extreme awareness look like to you?
Yeah, I think it goes to the topic that we were just discussing, which is to know all the aspects of the requests you're making, and to be able to have that. I would say that the system Zapier has is extreme awareness, and for them, it's out of necessity that they have that and are able to look and see what is the status code of this particular error that came back for this particular user. And I don't think it has to be like the security guard in the movies with all the screens. Like, there doesn't need to be a developer who's like, oh, there's this, user 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 has an error, and I'm going to go investigate that error now, right?
Right.
I think that level of awareness is beyond extreme. But to be able to see that in aggregate and be able to say not just one particular user, but we're seeing something at a level that we don't expect to be able to see, that kind of awareness, I think it's not typical and expected now, but I think we're moving into a time when that is going to be expected. And developers need to be able to have access to something that gives them that awareness. And when user 12345 emails in and says it doesn't work, then they can go and investigate that one thing.
Yeah.
But it's not like the alarms have to blare for one particular user. The alarms blare when you see things that are consistently happening, because really the issue's more likely to be with one API at a time than one user at a time.
Absolutely. That's a systemic problem. That's an issue that has to be addressed. That's affecting a group of customers, not just one. Yep. Absolutely. Excellent point. Well, Adam, thanks for joining us. Teams that will be watching this might want to learn more about content, and especially, talking to developer audiences. How can people find you?
Yeah, everydeveloper.com is the best place to look. Yeah.
Fantastic. Love the URL. Well, Adam, thanks again. Trung, Cameron, this has been great. Y'all can learn more about Haas at haas.com. And thanks again.